Please welcome back to the stage the CEO of the Pacific Asia Travel Association, Ms. Liz Ortiguera.
Welcome back, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce this afternoon's session, which is themed Recovery with Sustainability. As all of you here in the region know, these are two, neither one is, both are actually very, very compelling, critical priorities at this point in time. So you can't really have one without the other right now in our industry. Climate change and efforts to improve sustainability practices continue to be relevant throughout the travel industry, particularly as travelers are making more socially conscious decisions, as you heard in our presentations earlier, in their travel planning. Together, let's take a look at what's happening today, what's on the horizon, and how we can reduce the environmental impact of travel to contribute to positive change, especially as we look towards recovery in the region. I am honored to really to welcome our keynote speaker, and we are so pleased to have Professor Kishore Mahbubani join us. And I'll say a little bit about his background and then invite him to the stage. Kishore has enjoyed 3 distinguished careers in diplomacy, academia, and writing and speaking. In diplomacy, he served in the Singapore Foreign Service for 33 years, serving also as permanent secretary of the Foreign Ministry and 2 stints as Singapore's ambassador to the UN. He also served as the president of the UN Security Council from January 2001 and May 2002. In academia, he was the founding dean of Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at NUS, which is deemed to be the premier school in Asia in its field. He is also the author of 8 books, including The Asian 21st Century and Has China Won? Kishore Mahbubani is widely considered to be one of Asia's leading global public intellectuals, having appeared several times in Foreign Policy magazine's list of the top 100 global thinkers. In 2014, he was also listed by the Financial Times as one of the 50 individuals who would shape the debate on the future of capitalism. Perhaps the best summary of Kishore's contributions was made in the citation for the U.S. Foreign Policy Association Medal he received in June 2004. He is called a gifted diplomat, a student of history and philosophy, a provocative writer, and an intuitive thinker. It's my pleasure to welcome Professor Kishore Mahbubani to the stage. He'll present for 10 minutes, and then we'll go into a Q&A. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Liz, for that very generous introduction. But she hasn't done me a favor. She's raised your expectations too high. So my job is to lower them. Anyway, my big message to you, since I only have 10 minutes, I'm going to be quick and blunt, if you don't mind. My big message to you is that you are probably living in the most interesting time ever in human history. We've probably seen greater change in the last 30 years than we have seen in 3,000 years of human history. And the amazing thing is that most people are not aware that there's this huge change taking place. And this, as you know, is enormously relevant to the travel industry. Because if you can imagine a tidal wave, right, of huge economic development sweeping across Asia, that tidal wave will also carry up the travel industry. So all of you got to be ready for these huge changes that are coming. So the first question, of course, is why is this happening now? Why didn't it happen 50, 60 years ago? What's the big change, right? What's the reason? So there are these three significant reasons why in Asia we're seeing these remarkable changes. First is that, and I have to emphasize this, that the return of Asia is perfectly natural. And I say natural because from the year 1 to the year 1820, for 1800 out of the last 2,000 years, the two largest economies of the world were always those of China and India. So it's only in the last 200 years that Europe took off and North America took off. And since our mindsets are so imprisoned by the last 200 years, we've forgotten the 2,000 years of history. So what we are seeing now is a return to the 2,000-year-old norm. At the same time, to be completely candid, the reason why Asians are succeeding so well and why this will be the Asian 21st century, as I mentioned in my book list, is that the Asians have borrowed and learned from the best practices of the West. And so some of the best ideas of the West, like, for example, free market economics, free trade agreements, actually are being implemented with greater enthusiasm in Asia than they are in the West, where they came from. So today, you have a rather paradoxical situation whereby the principles of free trade were first taught to us, especially by American economists, and the United States of America cannot sign a free trade agreement because it's become politically toxic in the United States. And on the other hand, in January this year, Asia launched the world's largest free trade agreement, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which includes the 10 ASEAN countries and China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand. That's actually quite remarkable. Here you have a Western idea that is actually driving Asia up. And just to emphasize, by opening up, there's been remarkable shifts of power that have taken place. Just to give you two simple examples. In the year 2000, the United States economy in nominal market terms was 8 times the size of China's economy, 2000. By 2020, it was only 1.5 times larger. Another example, in the year 2000, Japan's economy was 8 times the size of ASEAN's economy, all 10 countries. Today, Japan's economy is only 1.5 times larger, and by 2030, ASEAN will be bigger than Japan. So you can see what dramatic shifts are taking place in the world, and as I said, more changes are coming. But as you know, life is never a simple good news story. I hope you're aware of that. There'll be challenges. And unfortunately for us, at the same time as we are seeing the most remarkable economic development in 2,000 or 3,000 years, we are also going to see in our time the greatest geopolitical contest ever in human history. And no two powers in the world have been as strong as the two great powers that are marching today towards this geopolitical contest, and this is the contest between the United States and China. You know, there's an Arab proverb which says, "He who speaks about the future lies, even when he tells the truth." That's true, the future is unpredictable. Despite that, I can tell you with great certainty that the geopolitical contest between US and China will accelerate in the next 10 years. So get ready for another storm that will also affect your lives. And we can discuss in the Q&A why it's happening, but as Liz mentioned, I've written a book, Has China Won, that explains it. And at the same time, there are other challenges, and I'm very glad that this conference is focused on one of the biggest and most fundamental challenges, the challenge of sustainability, the challenge of dealing with climate change. And as you know, travel has a paradoxical effect on the environment. On the one hand, there's no doubt, to travel, you burn up energy. And when you burn up energy, you throw out greenhouse gas emissions, and in one way or another, you're having adverse effects on the global environment. Yet at the same time, it's also clear that when people travel, they want to go and see nature, and actually the travel industry has all these magnificent benefits of preserving beautiful parts of the world also. So this is the paradoxical impact of the travel industry. And I think we have to weigh, therefore, how we take care both of enabling more people to travel, and I'll explain why more people will travel the next 10 to 20 years, while at the same time paying attention to the environmental consequences also. So why am I confident that the travel industry will continue to do very well? And here, let me go back to some basic data. I mentioned earlier at the very beginning that you're seeing this tidal wave of change. And one result of this tidal wave of economic development is that the middle classes, especially in Asia, are exploding. And in particular, I want to emphasize that the growth, especially in the next 10 to 20 years, will come from what I call the new CIA. Now, CIA doesn't stand for Central Intelligence Agency. The new CIA is China, India, and ASEAN. And just to give you some basic data, if you add up the population of ASEAN, 1.4 billion in China, 1.3 billion in India, 700 million people in ASEAN, it comes to about 3.4 billion people. Out of these 3.4 billion people, in the year 2000, there were only 75 million members in the middle class, only 75 million members. But by the year 2020, the number had grown to 1.1 billion, and by 2030 to over 2 billion. So you can see this new 2 billion members of the middle class are all going to queue up to buy air tickets, to travel, and therefore get ready for the biggest tidal wave ever in human history. Thank you very much. With that, I'm happy to welcome Liz back, and she's promised to interrogate me very hard. Thank you, Liz.
Thank you so much, Kishore. And it's such a pleasure, and I was explaining to Kishore during our briefing that our sector is so big that we spend a lot of time talking to each other within travel, and we have such diversity within our sector, many industries, but it is such a pleasure to have someone who sits above and outside of that to give us this landscape and this view to what's happening in the world today and what you anticipate to the extent that anyone can the future. And so I'm intrigued by your comment about the two superpowers in the next 10 years. One curious element is sitting here in Southeast Asia. Do you anticipate that with that escalation, that some markets will need to pick sides here in our region? Or will they continue to try and stay as neutral as possible?
Well, I think you just brought out the nightmare of ASEAN. ASEAN, as you know, the 10 states in Southeast Asia, the nightmare they're going to face in the next 10 years is whether or not they have to choose sides. And that's why, as of now, they made it very, very clear that they don't want to take sides. And in principle, they don't want to. The problem is that you have events and you also have decisions that they got to make. I'll give you a simple example. The ASEAN countries had to decide which telecommunications equipment to install, right? And guess what? A very good, cheap, well-functioning telecommunication system is produced by Huawei. But if you buy Huawei, it's not just a commercial decision. You buy Huawei, you get a phone call from Washington, D.C. saying, why are you buying Huawei? It's very dangerous. The Chinese are putting all kinds of intelligence equipment inside there. Be careful, and so on and so forth. And that's how you get caught in this crossfire between the two. But I should explain, by the way, given the 10-minute limit, I was very conscious not exceeding it. But the reason why I'm so confident that this US-China contest will gain momentum is because there's an iron law of geopolitics that's about 2,000 years old also, that says that whenever the world's #1 emerging power, which today is China, is about to overtake the world's #1 power, which today is the United States, the world's #1 power always pushes down the world's #1 emerging power, always. So what the United States is doing, therefore, in trying to thwart China's rise is perfectly normal behavior. And therefore, that's why I think it will accelerate. But at the same time, I think the ASEAN countries, in awareness of this, are actually coming together and trying to work together to send a message to both Washington, D.C. And Beijing. And I had actually the pleasure of having breakfast with President Jokowi of Indonesia in Bali on November 9th, a few days before the G20 meeting. And I said to him, it would be wonderful if you can organize a good meeting between President Xi and President Joe Biden in Bali, and he did. And you notice that since then, at least, the temperature has gone down. And what's really important here, by the way, I want to emphasize to you, is that there was a danger of war over Taiwan. Okay, there was a real danger. And the meeting, I think, has helped to lower the temperature on that area. So even though the conflict will accelerate, we've got to try and still find ways and means of ensuring that it doesn't spill over into war. Because I tell you, the biggest dampener for the travel industry is war.
And in addition to these international relations, in the last 2 weeks, we've seen unprecedented, or not since Tiananmen Square, this unrest in China. And so one question is, do you see this domestic unrest potentially changing their foreign and economic policy?
Well, I think the unrest certainly was a clear warning signal in China that China has got to, in one way or another, move away from its zero COVID policy. In fact, I wrote a column in the South China Morning Post 4 or 5 months ago saying that China should find ways and means of getting away from its zero COVID policy. But at the same time, I think the extent of the protests has been, in one way or another, exaggerated by the Anglo-Saxon media. And here a slight word of caution to you all. We get a lot of our information on the world from the Anglo-Saxon media. Be very careful when you read the Anglo-Saxon media on China. It doesn't really give a fair and balanced picture. And the Chinese government enjoys a far greater sense of legitimacy among the Chinese people than many governments in the past have, because the Chinese government has delivered, remarkable growth to the Chinese people. It's hard to believe that in 1980, you had 800 million people living in poverty in China, and today it's 0. When you rescue the largest number of people ever from poverty, people appreciate that. And so I don't think the political situation in China is that difficult, but it is still, nonetheless, it will be challenging, as you and I were discussing earlier, for China to come out of its zero COVID policy without getting too much disruption.
And one thing that's appreciated here in the region is that if we backtrack to a year and a half ago, China was at the forefront of vaccine diplomacy for the markets across Asia Pacific. And what is your view now on China's zero COVID strategy and their reintegration? You know, which we're all waiting with bated breath to see when will the giant market open up and how.
Well, my gut feel, I mean, China is, as you know, a very difficult society to understand. It's in many ways still a closed society. But my gut feel is that sometime over the course of the next 12 months, they'll find a way of getting out of the zero COVID policy, but there will be no big bang change, right? That's not how China works. There'll be small tweaks here, small tweaks there, small tweaks here, small tweaks there, and before you know it, the policy has sort of evaporated, you know, and that's how it'll work out. And there are many options they have. One of the problems that China has is that, unfortunately, everyone thinks that China, of course, is, they say it's a dictatorship, but this dictatorship has failed to vaccinate the older people because the older people refuse to be vaccinated because of memories in the past of bad experiences. So if they can make a bigger effort to vaccinate their older population, and if it's, as you know, if it's the Omicron virus, there's less danger of people dying from it than the previous strains.
Yes.
So hopefully the combination of the two would enable them to progressively open up.
Let me, just for a minute, shift the discussion over to sustainability. At COP27 and at G20, we heard a reinforced commitment to expand support for countries seeking funding for climate change initiatives. Do you feel we'll see significant shift?
Well, you know, the developed countries, this is a matter of fact, not a matter of opinion, have been making promises that haven't been kept. I don't know how many of you remember this $100 billion figure from Paris. And we still don't know of this, to this day, out of $100 billion, how much has been delivered. It's impossible to get the information on that. So similarly, in Egypt, there was a promise made to, you know, provide more financing for the least developed countries. Again, unfortunately, the problem that we face in the world today is that the developed societies are facing unique challenges that they haven't faced before. So Europe, for example, today, on the one hand, Europe is, as you know, preoccupied with the war in Ukraine. We haven't discussed it at all. It's causing major disruptions to the lives of people in Europe. And it's very difficult for governments that are frightened of being removed by populist parties to make concessions and give money outside. The populist parties will say that we need that money, don't give it to anybody else. So if governments feel insecure, they cannot be generous. That's one problem. And the United States also is going through a very challenging period. And the fact that Donald Trump has come back and said that he wants to be a candidate for president again, I think it'd be not just bad for the United States, but I think also bad for the world if Donald Trump comes back again, because he, as you know, is very nationalist and populist, and Donald Trump doesn't believe in giving money to anybody. He make America great again. That's his slogan. So if you have a situation where domestically the developed societies are having domestic problems, they cannot be generous. And therefore, the developing countries should be very realistic and learn to become more self-reliant in dealing with these climate challenges. And here, the only piece of good news is that, you know, when Donald Trump walked away from the Paris Accords, China and India could have said, hey, most of the greenhouse gas emissions up there have been put up by the Western countries since the Industrial Revolution. Why are you making us pay for it? So China and India could have walked away from the Paris Accords, but they didn't do so, which is a good sign. So the fact that the new emerging economic powers are committed to fighting climate change is a good sign. And I like the fact that China has come up with this concept of ecological civilization. And so they have an equal commitment to economic development and in protecting the ecology of China too.
Interesting. And you mentioned, you know, we all observe that rise in nationalism among the superpowers. Is it fair to say that there's been more of a spirit of collaboration here in Asia Pacific, across ASEAN and?
Well, I think the hidden miracle in East Asia is ASEAN. You know, because ASEAN is by far the most diverse region of planet Earth. No region in planet Earth, Latin America, Africa, South Asia, no region in planet Earth, you have among 680 million people, 250 million Muslims, 150 million Christians, 150 million Buddhists, Mahayana Buddhists, Hinayana Buddhists, then you have Hindus, Taoists, Confucianists, communists. So Southeast Asia is very diverse. And this area was called the Balkans of Asia. This area should be seeing more wars than any other region in the world. But there have been no wars in ASEAN since 1979, over 40 years now. Amazing. And at the same time, ASEAN is providing the platform for the great powers to talk to each other, right? And you notice that a lot of important meetings have taken place in Southeast Asia on the sidelines of all the important meetings going on here. So ASEAN, by remaining peaceful, is also exporting its culture of peace to the rest of East Asia. So overall, the reason why I'm optimistic for East Asia is that I think the peace will be preserved primarily because of the hidden effects of ASEAN.
Amazing, amazing. Well, I need to be fair and open up questions to the audience for Professor Mahbubani. Any hands in the audience? We have 2 mics that are roaming. Okay,
There's one at the back there.
In the back. Carl?
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Kishore, for that. Really enjoyed. I'll stand up. Sorry, Liz. Yeah, I was standing up. I want to ask Kishore, how much do you've talked about COP27 and COP26 and so forth. How much do you really believe that a multilateral governance, an institution that we see with COP, how much do you really believe that that will stand in the face of domestic national interest overall? Do you think that genuinely the Americans are going to actually back down? You mentioned the 100 billion in Paris. You're absolutely right. How much do you think one will outweigh the other?
Yeah. Well, you're right. I mean, the dominant thing that drives policy making is always domestic politics. You're right. But at the same time, since you mentioned I've served as ambassador to the UN twice and served as ambassador for over 10 years as ambassador UN, I also realize that multilateral settings create peer pressure. And as a result of that peer pressure, countries feel obliged to say, okay, I have to go to this COP meeting. I have to deliver something. I can't go there empty-handed. I have to make some commitments. And also, as you know, the most important relationship in terms of solving the climate change problem is the relationship between the 2 greatest economic powers, United States and China. And as you know, United States and China stopped talking about climate after the Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, which Tom Friedman of New York Times described as dangerous, reckless, irresponsible, and so on and so forth. So after that visit, US and China stopped talking. But guess what? Because they had to meet in COP, they started talking again. So that's what multilateral meetings do. They provide face-saving ways for countries to come together. Countries that refuse to talk to each other will talk to each other. and also you get the kind of peer pressure. But at the end of the day, it's also important for all of us, the public at large, to put even greater pressure on our governments to do more on climate change, because that I think is the ultimate force that will deal with it. We coming together to push the governments to do more.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Another question from the audience? Yes, I see one here. Eric? Eric has his hand up here in the front.
Thank you. Fascinating speech and fascinating discussion. Mr. Mahbubani, we see a lot in the social and the sustainability side of regulation coming out of Europe more in the last few years. Amid this landscape of future and changes, how will that regulation impact or be impacted going forward?
Yeah, that's a very good question. In some ways, it's good that Europe is trying to set some standards in this area, in the area of climate change too. But I think what worries many developing countries is that some of these regulations will be designed in such a way that they won't take into consideration the interests of the poorer countries. And the poorer countries may actually suffer. So for example, you know, if you're exporting products, right, from the poorer countries, they may impose European standards that are not realistic for developing countries. And I'll tell you a sad story which is true. When I was ambassador to the UN, I heard about how a Belgian NGO was trying to find out whether a certain company, textile company, was employing child labor. So they went to Bangladesh, they sneaked in, and they saw children in their factory, they exposed it, and the factory shut down. So the children were apparently rescued from child labor. Then they decided to go back a year later and see what happened to the children. They were rescued from child labor. They discovered a year later that the children were much worse off. And indeed, I'm sorry to say this, okay, it's a fact, okay? Many of them have become child prostitutes. So when you go there with good intentions to help people, be careful, be realistic, because you may end up actually creating situations that are worse. And at the end of the day, if you look at this whole story of Bangladesh, it's actually quite a remarkable story, because Bangladesh, when it became independent in 1971, was dismissed by Henry Kissinger, it's in our public record, as a basket case country that will go nowhere. And for many years, Bangladesh was the least developed country. But today, amazingly, the per capita income of Bangladesh is higher than that of India. Wow. So, you see? So therefore, you've got to realize that you've got to allow these developing countries time to grow and develop, and not necessarily impose your harsh European regulations on them.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much. And I'm heartbroken to say that we're running out of time. And I think I'll close by saying you raised an important point about travel being paradoxical. So we have a room full of travel leaders from across Asia Pacific and other regions. And it's actually in our hands to help that pivot, you know, more towards the right side of travel. And travel can incredibly be a force for good, you know, in terms of jobs creation, poverty alleviation. We just need to make more of the right choices. And so thank you so much. You've been insightful, inspiring, and we wish we could keep you longer. So thank you.
Thank you. Let's take a picture. I think there's a good camera, but let the camera really go.